You're watching Rogers TV, Barrie.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Midland Cultural Centre, and welcome to A Day in the Life. Now, here is the host of A Day in the Life, Fred Hacker.
Well, good evening and welcome. So glad to see all of you here this evening. This is the 123rd program in our series of A Day in the Life. We've been doing this program for 10 years now, and we continue to find fascinating people like our guests this evening. The program is sponsored by a season sponsor and also by a show sponsor. And our season sponsor for many years now has been Bales, Dishaw, and Holloway Financial Advisors. And I believe that Michelle Dishaw and Jeff Holloway are here this evening. If so, wave. Oh, there's Michelle. Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for your support. And you may have noticed on the posters for this program that our show sponsor was anonymous. And there's a reason for that I'm going to explain to you right now. And I want to ask the father of our guest, Alan Mostyn, if he will stand up for me. Now, Alan, I don't want to embarrass, well, yes, I do want to embarrass you. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. The reason why our show sponsor was shown as anonymous was that we wanted to surprise you tonight by telling you that this evening's program is sponsored by your high school classmates. Wow. Yeah. And to give credit where credit is due, Peggy Breckenridge was the one who, she's in Florida. But from Florida, she organized her classmates to sponsor the program. So, Al, I thought you'd be pleased by that. And I'll just mention one other thank you, and that is to my old buddy Bill Mackey, whose suggestion it was that we invite Michael this evening. So we want to welcome the folks in the hall here. We also want to welcome our friends who are joining us on community television, Rogers, and we hope that you enjoy this evening's program. It's now my pleasure, my privilege, and my honor to introduce our guest for this evening. Please welcome Michael Mostyn. Have a seat. Well, it is so good to see you.
Great to see you.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for getting me out to Midland.
Your family is legendary in this community, whether you know it or not. And we've just paid tribute to your father, who, as I think you know, was a friend of mine growing up in Midland, as was his brother, your Uncle Murray. So it's great to see them. What we try and do with this program, Michael, is through you see what has inspired you to achieve what you've achieved in your life, and also through you to inspire our audience, both those here in the hall and those who are watching on television. So let's begin by doing a little biographical research here and ask you to tell us when and where you were born.
Born in Toronto, 1974.
74.
Yeah.
And we have met your father already, but your mother is here. And I think I'm an equal opportunity host, so I'm going to ask her to stand up too. Sheila, welcome. Now, we have a shot of Sheila, although people have seen her live here now, but there's a picture of the two of you together. Tell us about your mom, the influence that she has had on your life, Michael.
My mother's had a major influence on my life and my brother and sister's lives. She was, my mother ran the household. My mother taught us how to stand up for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Really, she was so involved in all of our lives, and it didn't stop at childhood. Throughout into adulthood, our mother is just integral to everything.
And we've already met your father, but Alan, I don't know whether you remember this picture, but it was actually your son who provided it to me. We used this picture for a program 2 shows ago when Chester Graham was our guest. That's where I saw it. Yeah. And now this is amusing. I was sent this picture today in the mail by Bob Swales, who is the one of the 2 people who are dressed in civvies in that picture. Bob lives in Colorado Springs now, and sent this picture because he'd seen it online. So now, which of these good-looking guys is your father?
Well, let's see. Standing top left.
Top left,
My side, yeah.
The other good-looking guy standing top right is also here this evening, sitting up here with you.
A tall fellow, looks like.
And the guy holding the trophy is right over here. Is Chester here? Chester, where are you? There's Chester, too. So Chester is standing beside me in the back row between me and the civvy. Yeah. Yeah, Chester grew after that picture a lot. Yeah. Now, we have another picture of your dad. I recognize you. I recognize your dad. With Stephen Harper.
It's Stephen Harper.
Yeah. Now, let's meet the rest of the family. How many of the people in the hall here are old Midland? How many people in the hall here grew up in Midland or lived in Midland? Yeah, there's a few. Okay. Well, some of you then will remember this pair. Tell us who these people are.
So these are my grandparents, my father's parents, Myer and Sadie.
Myer and Sadie. And we have a great picture of Myer, and I remember him so well. And an editorial in the Free Press from 1974, the year your mother died. And I don't know whether the folks can read that who are here in the hall, but it is a wonderful tribute by the editor of the Free Press, your mother, or your grandmother, about when she used to walk by and stop and chat with them. So we truly do all miss Sadie. Now, you don't remember this, but I do. This is the family store. Alan, you remember that. Murray remembers it. Yeah. Yeah. Now, we have another picture here. Can you introduce this cast of characters?
Absolutely. So this is my father and his brothers. So Stan, who unfortunately has passed, Harold, who's here tonight, and Lou, and Murray. And my father.
So Murray's here.
And Murray's here as well.
Murray, do you want to stand up? Thank you. And Stan is here?
No, Harold.
Harold, sorry. Harold, would you stand up? Welcome. And did you tell me that Lou is still practicing law?
Lou is still practicing law.
Wow. Wow. Good for him. Now, let's just quickly chat about your siblings. You have a brother?
And a sister.
And tell me about Matthew briefly.
So Matthew, also a lawyer, practiced law with him for a little while, both of us in the firm, and now he's successful working for an architectural company as a house counsel.
And this young lady, well, these 2 young ladies, we've met your mother. We seem to have a lot of Stephen Harper pictures here.
Yeah, we're kind of Stephen Harper fans in my family.
Yeah. And your sister.
Yes. So my sister, she wanted to fit in as a real Mostyn, so she married a lawyer.
Okay. Yeah. That's great. Now let's talk about your school days. Tell us first of all about where you did your elementary school.
Elementary school was Associated Hebrew Day Schools in Toronto.
Mm-hmm. And what sorts of What would be special about that school that folks who perhaps aren't familiar with that school, what kinds of things would you study?
Sure. So it's a Jewish school, and they teach you actually how to pray in the Jewish tradition, and they teach you the Bible, Torah in Hebrew, and so it's both the secular program and you get a full Hebrew day school program as well, and they teach you how to speak Hebrew.
And I was interested chatting with you that was really the first time that you learned about the Holocaust was attending that school. What was your reaction when you first heard that?
So my family, and I mean, you could see my family's been in Canada for generations on both sides. So thankfully, I didn't lose any close family in the Holocaust. I learned about it in grade 5 at Associated, and it was shock to learn. I hadn't heard stories like that at home. And when I heard about how Jews were going into the cattle cars and were slaughtered, to me it just seemed absolutely unbelievable that that's the way that something could have taken place.
Yeah. We have had the privilege of hosting both Eva Olsen and Max Eisen, both of whom you know. And I think some of the folks who were here this evening heard those programs, both of them being Holocaust survivors, and both of them having amazing stories and being quite fascinating people. You mentioned to me the partisans and the role that they played and the impact that they had on you. Can you tell us briefly who they are and what the impact was?
Absolutely. So I was very privileged, again, in the practice of law at Mostyn Mostyn. We had another partner there, Alex Kramer, and he was a partisan. And so he was somebody who lived in the forest and was somebody who, during the course of the war, was taking down Nazis and actually spent time after the war as well, hunting some Nazis down. So not everyone, was obviously inside of these camps. Everybody had a different story, and there were certain individuals that took justice into their own hands.
Yeah, I was not aware of the role of the partisans. I know that when we were in Israel, we learned all about the freedom, the what were they called? The fighters. I'm going to refer to my notes here. The group who were active. Where will I find it?
Which one?
The freedom fighters in 45, 46.
Oh, okay.
In Israel,
Yep.
when forcing the Brits out and creating the state of Israel.
Yep.
So similar sort of thing. Now let's talk about some of your activities while you were in elementary school. I have a picture here, and I'm not sure who this guy is. It might be Austin Matthews. No?
It's Austin Matthews with a little less talent that ended up having to use his brain for a living. So that's me as a child playing hockey.
And we have one as you're getting a little older here, I guess. Yeah.
Yep.
Now you also had a very unusual activity that you were engaged in. Tell us about that.
Sure. I think you might be referring to Taekwondo.
Taekwondo.
Yes. Yeah. So I started in grade 1 while I was at Associated, and ended up by grade 7 becoming a black belt.
And we have a picture here of the certificate that you received as a black belt. Why did you get into? Tell us what Taekwondo is, and then explain to us why you got involved.
Sure. So it's a Korean traditional martial arts form, and the reason I got involved was actually my mother. Once again, the influence of my mother. Unfortunately, I had a schoolyard incident when I was in grade 1. There was a child who was being bullied by some grade 4s, and who were much bigger than a grade 1 at the time. And so I got into the middle of it, got beaten up pretty badly. And my mother wanted to enroll me into a martial art where I could take care of myself, and introduced me to actually another lifelong mentor of mine, Mr. Kim, who, and my mother's instructions, and I'll never forget this, she said, "I want you to teach him how to fight 3 guys at once." And it wasn't the way things were done in the class, but those were my mother's instructions, and that's what he did.
That's great. That's great. Secondary school. Where did you attend?
So I went into CHAT, which is the Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto.
Okay. And how many years did you spend there?
I spent 3 years there, and then actually the last year I went over to William Lyon Mackenzie, which is a public high school.
And what kind of activities were you engaged in as a secondary school student?
Cross-country team, soccer. I went on to the soccer team.
Now tell us about your soccer experience, because there was something there that I think was formative for you.
Yes. What was interesting playing in those leagues, in the school league, was we were the only Jewish team, and so we were actually in the Catholic school league. And one of my first experiences with antisemitism, actually. So I remember very well at the soccer match, I was sort of off on the side, and we have all these training balls, and I had a knife pulled on me, and I was called a slur, and really I just said, okay, you know. You want the soccer balls that badly, take them. I'm not going to get stabbed they're not even my balls, they belong to the school. But yeah, that was an impactful experience.
Yeah, and leads to your current vocation, directly or indirectly, I guess.
Maybe, unbeknownst to me, maybe.
Yeah. Summer jobs while you were in secondary school, did you have
yeah,
experiences?
Worked at summer camps, got to unload a warehouse from time to time, and actually setting up a file system in my father's law firm.
Ah, so that's the first exposure to the workings of a law firm, grunt work.
That's right.
Now tell us about where you went to university and what you studied.
Sure. Went to UWO at the time, and now it's Western, and I studied philosophy in my undergrad.
And you graduated with, there's a nice picture with your mother, another one with your father. What sort of influence would your undergraduate years have had on you?
I think there was a lot of opening my mind to different experiences. I got to study different religions, different sort of philosophies from different parts of the world that I wasn't exposed to in high school.
And then you were involved in some extracurricular activities there. You're on the Dean's Honor List, congratulations, and you received the Honor W Award. What was that for?
That was for community involvement in the student community, university student life.
And what sorts of things were you doing?
I got involved in the Jewish Student Union, and what else? I think that was the reason why I got that award.
Were there any individuals at university who had an influence on you, professors or other students?
I think certainly, you make a lot of friends at university. I really valued the experience actually of living away from home. In London, it's not too far away, so you can still go back on the weekend and get your laundry done, and I greatly appreciated that. But I think it's living away from home, formed some great friendships in undergrad.
Now, the next stop on your journey was law school, again at Western. And we have a graduation picture here with Mom and Dad. You received an award while you were there. Can you tell us about that? The Douglas May Memorial Award?
Yes. So that was for contract drafting.
Okay.
Oh, no, sorry. That wasn't. I got a contract drafting award in the first year. The Douglas May was for, again, I think, involvement in through the law school and.
Online it said that you made a significant contribution to the quality of life.
Sounds
Can't do much better than that. And you delivered a paper in York, England while you were in law school.
I did.
How did that come about?
I was taking, one of my courses was on internet and the law, and it was relatively new back then in 1999. So I just submitted my paper to a conference and was lucky enough to have been chosen to deliver that paper. And actually that was my first publication in third year of law school.
Yeah, congratulations. So you were called to the bar in?
Called to the bar 2001.
2001. Now, tell us where you practiced and with whom.
So I practiced in Toronto at Mostyn Mostyn law firm, beginning with my uncle Lou and with my father Alan.
Now, we mentioned that Lou is still practicing. How old is Lou?
I don't know. I know you don't ask women their age. You ask, are you
Well,
ask men their
I
age
think he
nowadays?
deserves a lot of credit to still be practicing.
How old is Lou now? 87? 89.
Yeah. Your father told me that earlier. That's the reason I'm asking the question.
That's pretty close.
Yeah, that's unfair. We have a picture here. Tell us who's in the picture.
So these are the lawyers of Mostyn Mostyn. So my father Alan and Lou are on both sides, and beside me is my brother Matthew.
Okay, we heard about him but didn't see him earlier, so that's great. Okay, now just confidentially, and we won't let your father hear this, but what's it like practicing law with your dad?
You know, it's awful. No. Honestly, it was a beautiful experience because not a lot of kids get the opportunity to work with their parents.
True.
And when you can work well, you see another side. I saw another to my uncle Lou and my father.
Yeah.
You learn a lot, and you see the way that they deal with clients. You see the way that they deal with real world problems, and I think you develop a new respect, and it teaches you a lot about how you should behave as a professional.
That's interesting, yeah. Yeah. I had a similar experience, not with a family member, but I began working for a local lawyer when I was 16. And watching the interaction between lawyer and client was probably the most valuable thing that I learned. The respect that was shown to the client, the respect that was reciprocated by the client.
Well, at this firm, it wasn't always respect to the clients. We had all kinds of clients, and the amazing, and this was one of the things my father taught me, was I've never seen this in my life, but he would sit them down and he would lecture the client.
Yes.
You can't behave like this. And, and he expected them, if it was a criminal client, never to come back into the law firm again.
Yeah,
and you're actually driving away the business.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's great. Now, the next phase that I want to just touch on is your political career. You ran federally in a couple of elections in the early 2000s. Tell us about the lead up to that, because it's kind of interesting. You didn't end up running against who you thought you were going to run against.
No. So, I ended up running for the first time in 2004 election, and in the riding of York Centre, I thought I was running against Art Eggleton, who
was a cabinet minister.
Cabinet minister, defense minister, former mayor of Toronto. So, kind of a big deal.
Easy pickings.
Easy pickings.
Yeah.
And 1 week before the election, I discovered, after all of this preparation with my friends who also had no political experience, that I wasn't going to be running against him at all.
You were, in fact, running against someone else. Who were you running against?
A 6-time Stanley Cup champion, Ken Dryden. So went from here to there.
Yeah. Art Eggleton was easy pickings by comparison.
Turned out that way.
Yeah. Ken was a guest on this program a few years ago, and I know he's a friend of yours now. This is a campaign poster from one of your early election campaigns. And this picture fascinates me. Can you explain to our audience what this is all about?
I would explain it better if I was fluent in Russian, but that's actually one of the large community groups in this riding. But there you can see Ken Dryden and myself, and they were doing profiles of the different candidates in the election campaign.
In Russian? Isn't that
in Russian. There were actually, it was a completely multicultural campaign, and really, I became involved in so many communities through the political process.
And Ken Dryden would be known to the Russian community because of his hockey prowess.
I think so.
Yeah.
Almost as well as to the Canadians, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Now, you weren't successful in those campaigns, but you did increase the percentage of the vote that your party received, and you that riding did eventually become a conservative riding, didn't it?
It did.
Later on, yeah. You also ran provincially. What year was that?
That was in 2011.
And where was that?
Same riding, York Centre,
York Centre?
Toronto, North York.
And who were you running against?
I was running against Monty Quinter.
Now, Monty Quinter holds a record for having been the oldest person to ever serve in the legislature. He served for 33 years and he retired at the age of 89. Now, he wasn't quite 89 when you were running against him, but I'll bet he was in his 80s.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. When I was doing my research preparing for this, and I don't know whether you're aware of this, there was an incident involving him, an incident of anti-Semitic behavior. Are you familiar with that?
I think it was a bit before, I was paying attention to politics.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Apparently it was during a nomination convention in '96, which would be...
Sorry, yes, I did hear about that.
Earlier, and certainly long before your political involvement, but there was a smear campaign run against him, which was, I thought in hindsight, would be interesting to you.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about what you do for a living, Michael. And first of all, for those in our audience, both here and on television, who aren't familiar with the organization, tell us about B'Nai Brith.
Sure. So B'Nai Brith is the oldest Jewish organization in the country. It was established in 1875, and it really grew out. Every small town had a B'Nai Brith branch. If you can think of it like the Lions Club or Rotary, how it's everywhere. At a time of new Jewish immigration, they wanted to have a social network. They wanted to be able to, play sports together. They lift each other up, give business loans, and help each other out with getting an education. That's how it started. And over the years, it centralized and has grown into a human rights organization, an organization that really focuses on helping the needy through food programs, affordable housing, free clothing, things like that.
Now, one of our guests who's in the audience this evening stopped me on the street a few days ago and said, what does B'Nai Brith stand for? So perhaps you can answer that question.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. It's, we get that question a fair bit. It's actually, B'Nai Brith is B'Nai Brith in Hebrew, and it literally means children of the covenant.
Okay. Now, you've spoken about the humanitarian side of the organization, but there's also a human rights side to it. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. So actually in 1913, it began that functioning. Folks might have heard of the Anti-Defamation League in the United States. Well, the League for Human Rights is the name of the ADL in Canada, and that's under the B'Nai Brith umbrella. So we produce an annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents since 1982, run an anti-hate hotline, and we do our best to help the victims of discrimination and hatred, a particular focus on antisemitism, but really trying to assist the marginalized in Canada.
Now, I did read that the vision is for a stronger civil society in Canada, fostering diversity and inclusion. What does it mean, a stronger civil society? How does that speak to you?
Well, a stronger civil society means our institutions, but it means basic respect for human dignity. A civil society can take very strong positions and opposing positions, but at the end of the day, they can respect the individual or the community that's presenting them. So it's about basic decency, basic respect. And
can you tell us some of the kinds of programming that the organization runs today?
Sure. So on the humanitarian side, we're actually blue ribbon affordable housing operators. We own and operate 3 affordable housing buildings in Toronto. We are the only Jewish communal organization to own and operate its own clothing donation program. So these bins that you see sometimes on the street, we have those, and we give pop-up shops. So to give to members of the community, and we like to focus on members of other communities that don't have infrastructure and really are desperate, like the Yazidi community, for example, new community into Canada, and assist them with gently used clothes that otherwise going to make its way into the landfill. Food programs, And on the other side, we do diversity programming, educational programs, and standing up for the rights, again, of those that are discriminated against in society.
Let's just focus on that for a minute. The organization does speak to government, media, and so forth.
Yes.
When we drill a little deeper into your particular role, we'll explore that. But what is the purpose for that function, the speaking to government and media?
I think the purpose of the function is government, first of all, needs to understand from whatever community, who are representative groups. We are one of the major representative groups. So if they have questions or they're seeking input into various public policy issues, B'Nai Brith will always be consulted by all levels of government, and also because we're deeply rooted in communities across the country.
If we were to ask people who are familiar with the organization what it is most respected for, what would you say the top 2 or 3 things would be?
Great question. I think, first of all, would be most deeply respected for the outreach that we do, honest outreach with other grassroots communities, and sometimes taking on issues that we think is important for Canada, we think it's important for our community, but it isn't necessarily focused on ours, and using the courts sometimes to enforce rights. So, for example, there was one court action where we helped to fight for the rights of Sikhs to wear their kirpan, which is a religious item. And another thing that we're respected for is being an organization of principle, and standing up for what we believe is right and what our community believes is right, whether or not it's politically speaking or publicly speaking. We're not interested in polling, and we're not interested to go along to get along. We're grounded in principles, and we just believe in doing the right thing. And if there's any consequences, if we're going to lose a government grant for standing up to the government, that's okay. It'll impact us. We're not afraid to sue the government, for example.
Michael, I've heard that B'Nai Brith is very active in supporting seniors. What kind of programs do you have?
So pre-COVID, we were supporting a lot of Holocaust survivors, a lot of senior shut-ins. We would have a daily food program where these seniors needed a hot meal, but they came for the programming. And they could say, great, I'm here, it's a great program, and I get a hot meal, which I really need. When COVID hit, we had to shut that down. We did follow-up calls a couple days later and realized that some of these folks weren't eating. And they weren't being looked after by other social agencies. Nobody really knew what was going on. So we kickstarted a volunteer program within 1 week and began home meal delivery for immunocompromised, mostly, vast majority of them being seniors, and individuals that were not being supported by other agencies, people from all over the place. Individuals could be downtown Toronto, out in Scarborough, and we quickly developed a younger volunteer network delivering the foods out there. We've been going actually nonstop since March 2020. Right now we're supporting about 200 families just in Toronto, but we have also food programs in Winnipeg, Montreal.
Well done, well done. How does the organization get its financial support?
By just people who care. We're an organization that really is grassroots, so really we rely to a large extent on individual donors, many of them being at lower levels, $100 lodge members. We have some very generous donors as an organization, but it really is built as grassroots, and that's where we get our support from.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about your role. You started off as the National Director of Public Affairs. And where were you centered and what were you doing?
So that was based in Ottawa.
Okay.
I actually left the practice of law for that position and moved to Ottawa. I did that for close to 5 years, and it was really dealing with the government, explaining to them the issues of the Jewish community and human rights, and working on justice, immigration issues, national security issues, and working with foreign embassies that were of interest to the Jewish community and B'nai Brith.
During, I guess it perhaps was a little earlier than that, in 2007, I understand that you were on the Canadian delegation to the International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research in Prague. Was that while you were in the director's position?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And tell us about that experience, who you met with, how the program developed.
Sure. So that was actually a delegation that was led by, at the time, Minister Jason Kenney, for Canada to sign on to, and this was the first public event where Canada was indicating this, the IRA, which is an international organization that requires its members to properly memorialize, research the Holocaust. And so Canada began the process at that year. I was one of 2 civil society representatives. I was the B'nai Brith representative, obviously, and got to travel to Prague and participate in the delegation.
And then you became the CEO of the organization. What year was that?
That was in 2014.
And I think we have there we go. Yeah. Newspaper article announcing your new position. Tell us what you do, Michael. What's the CEO of B'nai Brith do?
Well, now I can't be as specialized anymore. I got to be worried about the fundraising of the organization. We're not an organization that relies on professional fundraisers, so I'm the fundraiser, and I oversee basically all of the activities. So any new programs we do, managing staff. I had to learn to become a manager, and just basically overseeing all of the activities on the League for Human Rights, the activism of the organization, and overseeing all of our staff that run our great humanitarian relief programs.
You're also the senior spokesperson.
Yeah.
How much of your time does that take, and who do you speak to?
To be honest, it depends on the day.
Yes.
It's one of these jobs where you wake up in the morning and you can have a plan, but something's in the news, particularly an anti-Semitic incident. The media starts calling, and so I'm regularly speaking to national media and media in various cities across the country. And unfortunately, typically when they're calling me, it's because there's been an incident of anti-Semitism that they'd like a community spokesperson to speak to.
You also speak out on behalf of other groups who are defamed or the victims of hate, and I'm not sure that that's something that everybody understands. So I wonder if you would just explain some of the other groups that you've spoken out on behalf of.
Sure. So, for example, from my time up in Ottawa in 2008, began speaking out for Falun Dafa and Uyghur Muslims, who are both oppressed minority groups in China, and doing a lot of outreach with them. There's a number of groups. We've been working with Black community groups. In fact, during my time at B'nai Brith, again, before I was CEO, unfortunately, Jordan Manners was the first Black youth killed in a high school in the city of Toronto. And we rallied between B'nai Brith and the Black community to basically get the government, the provincial government at the time, to launch an inquiry into the origins of violence, youth violence. And we did that successfully, working together. So there's a host of different communities. Right now we're working closely with the Filipino community, a number of new Canadian and older Canadian communities on various issues that are important to them.
You are referred to as the person who speaks out on behalf of Canadian Jewry. How many Jewish citizens do we have in this country?
Got about approximately 400,000.
Okay. And so part of your responsibility is to recognize their concerns and interests and advance them on their behalf?
We do our best. It's a diverse community, just like every community. It's not monolithic in any way. So one of the interesting things, because again, we're grassroots, we always try and not speak for others, but by understanding and having members of the various different Jewish communities involved with us geographically, religiously, we tend to get it right.
Do you feel that the landscape in Canada has been altered by the work of B'Nai Brith?
I do. I think actually B'Nai Brith has had a major impact in many ways on Canada.
There was an 8-point plan to tackle anti-Semitism. Was that your plan or implemented by you?
It was partially. One of the great things that makes B'Nai Brith great is the people involved. So there were a number of individuals that were playing with it and touching it and envisioning it. But yeah, it was under my leadership as CEO, and as a team, we developed that plan.
Now, the program's called A Day in the Life, and we're always interested in what a typical day. I don't think you have many typical days, but what kinds of things would you spend a day on?
Great question. So like we said, it could be media availability, dealing with an issue. We try and be reactionary and proactive in our approach. So we're constantly working on forward-looking projects and reactionary stuff. I get pulled into both universes. So there's research where we put out press releases that are often picked up by the media. So would have my hand in that. Trying to get events that deal with major topical issues that we think of interest, by the way, not just for the Jewish community, but for those beyond that care about issues like terrorism and making sure that we don't see support, seeing our police forces get the right sorts of supports and policy supports up in Ottawa. So it could be any and all of those things, let alone there's an emergency situation in Afghanistan, and there's refugees from Afghanistan that are coming in.
Right.
And we want to show Jewish community support to these new refugees coming into the country. So working to help them out in their time of need.
I have a couple of pictures that show that it isn't all glamour. Do you mind if I show them?
Let's see.
Here you are on a loading dock with I'm not sure what's being shipped or
that actually is the Afghan. It was a electronics drive and a clothing drive for Afghan refugees. That's actually Robin Martin, MPP from Toronto, and Michael Levitt and his wife. Michael Levitt is actually the CEO of Friends of Simon Wiesenthal. Both of our organizations were working together because we really wanted to send that as a message that you're fleeing an awful situation. And by the way, you are all involved somehow in saving Canadian soldiers and working with Canadian soldiers overseas.
Right.
So it's our obligation as Canadians to now welcome you into this country, and we wanted them to know that because they have a different education system and they might be thinking a certain way about Jews. Well, wouldn't it be nice to come in and say this is the first group that's extending their arms to help us out?
Michael Levitt was an MP himself, was he not?
He was.
Yeah. Now here's another picture that shows you really hard at work. What's happening here?
This is another drive. We're constantly doing these things. Most recently, we did a drive for the Ukrainian refugees, obviously. We're all watching on the news what's happening right now with Russia. And so there's been just a huge outpouring of support. And because we've created this mechanism through our clothing donation program, and we have this volunteer network, it's just allowing us, when emergency situations like this pop up, to roll into action.
Now, I'm going to guess that the next picture is where you're most comfortable.
Okay.
Behind the podium, right?
Yeah. Don't have to get my hands as dirty. But that's, I guess, giving a a talk somewhere.
Yeah, and you do a lot of that.
I do a lot of talking.
Yeah,
That's why I need the water.
I want to sort of change our course a little bit here and talk about the problem, if I may, and I want to begin with making sure that we all have the same definition of anti-Semitism. Can you give us a classic definition?
Sure. So the definition that the Canadian government now uses is the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is really just saying that anti-Semitism is a certain manifestation of hatred targeting Jews. And there are certain illustrative examples that are given to this, but basically it's just saying, that it is the targeting of Jews for hate. And the uniqueness about anti-Semitism, which some folks may not understand, is that sometimes Jews are nowadays collectively thought to reflect of what the state of Israel may be doing in terms of its policies. And so on university campuses, that's now the predominant form of anti-Semitism. So it explains, when criticism of Israel can become anti-Semitic and can have an impact on individual Jews, and when it's not anti-Semitic. And it's not, obviously, when you treat Israel the same as any other country in the world. Every country is open to criticism.
And it's described as a form of racism. Is it?
Anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to clarify the term.
Sure.
Because the word Semite includes more groups than just Jews, right?
It does.
So it includes Arabs and Assyrians, as well as Jews. So anti-Semitism doesn't include being opposed to all of those groups. Am I right with that?
It's so interesting you raise this, because there's actually two spellings for anti-Semitism. You can have the dash there, anti-Semitism, or you can do anti-Semitism, one word.
Okay.
B'Nai Brith, we use that one word. We actually have an ongoing struggle with Canadian press, who every time we put out a press release, changes our spelling. As the Jewish Human Rights Organization fighting anti-Semitism, they change it and they say, no, you spelt it wrong. No, we spelt it right. And the reason why we spell it that way is because the original term anti-Semitism was coined back in the 1890s in Germany, and it was used as a term to mean Jew hatred, right? And then so we sort of adopted that term to, we want to fight against the hatred of Jews. But using that dash would allow an individual who, say, is not a Jew, but is a Semite, to say, well, wait a second, I can't possibly be an anti-Semite because I'm a Semite and I love myself, right? Come on. You know the term is supposed to mean the targeting of Jews. So it's just another reason why that spelling shouldn't be used, because it confuses the situation. The term is clearly supposed to mean hatred toward Jews as it's used today.
Right. And it comes from a German word, Judenhass,
correct,
which means hater of Jews.
Correct.
Yeah. Tell us what the different types of anti-Semitism are. How does it manifest itself?
It can manifest itself in violence, in harassment, in graffiti. Those are the three ways that we track it in our audit, in those manifestations. And nowadays, online harassment is a growing concern.
I've read the term pogrom. Can you explain to us what that means? Because it may come up as we look into some history.
Sure. So a pogrom would be a group attack on Jews, essentially, and it was used a lot in with respect to Europe. That term came up a lot.
I want to take a minute, and I've told you before, I'm fascinated by this subject, so we'll probably get more deeply into it than some might want. But I'm fascinated by the history of anti-Semitism, which goes back long before that term was coined, in the 19th century in Germany. My studies indicate that it goes back at least 1,000 years, because the first crusade, even before that, the Rhineland massacres, we're back in 1096. And then England actually had an edict of expulsion in 1290. Are people aware of that the Jews were expelled from England that long ago?
I'm not sure. I would hazard a guess to say no, because it's hard enough, even with school kids, to know about the Holocaust.
With what we're going through right now with this pandemic, during the Black Death, Jews were persecuted in the mid 1300s. Spain has an unenviable record in its dealing with its Jewish population. Spanish Jews were massacred in 1391. Spanish Inquisition is certainly infamous, and Jews were then expelled from Spain in 1492. We have a lot of sympathy these days for valid reasons for Ukraine, but it doesn't have a great record either. The Cossack massacres in the mid-1600s massacred Jews. The Russian Empire carried out anti-Jewish pogroms, to use the term we used before. The Dreyfus Affair in France is famous in the late 1800s, and then of course the Holocaust. The Holocaust, I'm not quite sure where to begin on that subject with you, Michael. I'm always shocked at denials because the reality of the Holocaust is so well documented. And I'm horrified that a third of the Jews in the world were exterminated during that period of time. You speak to the public a lot about this subject. Do people get that? Do they know? Is that part of the public wisdom on the subject, do you think?
It depends on the audience, to be honest. I think it depends on what part of the world you come from, and what your own experiences are. If you never met a Jew in your life, you probably don't know that. I think Canadians from military families tend to get it, because they I had my grandfather, my father fought against the Nazis.
Yeah.
They kind of get it, even if they don't know all of the stories about the Jewish community. But I think a lot of it is where you come from.
Is there a continuing denial movement in Canada?
Absolutely. Denial, and what's even worse sometimes is the distortion.
And what form does the distortion take?
The distortion, it basically gets at, the Jews caused it, or there was a conspiracy with the Jews and Hitler, to do this. It was the Zionists. It's all a conspiracy to grab something or other, and which basically will find its way into various anti-Semitic tropes. So you can deny it outright, but I think today most folks, they'll sort of, say there's a grain there, but it's being completely misrepresented by the mainstream society for malign reasons.
We went through a little bit of the history up to the Holocaust. Certainly there have been Soviet anti-Jewish policies subsequent to World War II. And now there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Can you tell us about that, where it's coming from and why?
Well, in the Middle East today, it's Iran. Iran is driving it. They are the premier state sponsor of terror in the world. They have proxy organizations, the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, whose duty it is to protect the Iranian Revolution, which took place in 1979, and who, of course, shot down the Ukrainian Airlines flight, which murdered many Canadians on that flight. They sponsor Hezbollah, Hamas, terror groups which don't just focus on the Middle East, but actually have reached out to commit murder in various parts of the world over time.
There have also been many incidents in Christian Europe of anti-Semitism since the early part of the 20th century. Is that continuing?
It's there. It's there in Europe today in certain, I think it's tying itself into certain nationalistic movements within certain countries. It's unfortunately, it's like a virus, anti-Semitism. It's always finding a way to get itself into the modern discourse in a way that allow people to obsess with it. It's a very clever virus, unfortunately. Won't go away.
Michael, B'Nai Brith is committed to building understanding and overcoming hatred. How do you define hatred?
How do I define hatred? I think it's, hatred is purposeful. So some people can be ignorant, and you can teach those people. But I think when it becomes an internal obsession and a purposeful one, that's hate.
And my reading would indicate that hate is on the rise. Is that driven in part by the pandemic?
I think the pandemic has driven the polarization of society, politically, and yes, we can see it, different groups being targeted. Growth in hatred by StatsCan, the Asian community, the Black community. Interestingly, hate crimes for religiously motivated hate crimes have been on the decline for the last number of years. There's only one group that's bucking that trend, unfortunately, which is the Jewish community. That it's been continuing to increase. And I think the reasons why during COVID is because COVID, the conspiracies we see online, attacks on Asians, even though Jews have nothing to do with this whatsoever, because anti-Semitism is so tied into conspiracy theory, it's so easy to tie Jews into the narrative. And
collate the two,
Exactly.
We do keep seeing examples, including in Canada. I read that in 2020, the police reported 2,669 criminal incidents motivated by hate. And that was a 37% increase in that 1 year. That can't all be driven by COVID, can it?
No.
Much of the Canadian increase targeted Blacks and East Asians and South Asians and Indigenous people. But as you mentioned, the hate crimes against Jews continues to rise. I read in the New York Times that on 2 weekends, and this is just a couple of weeks ago, on 2 weekends in a row, physical force was used against Jewish men in the streets of New York in daylight. One was punched, and anti-Semitic graffiti was found on the roof of a bus in New York City. A swastika was found on that bus. Are those isolated incidents, or do you confront that all the time?
So fortunately, violence is generally isolated in Canada. Predominantly, you'll see harassment, a lot of online harassment nowadays, particularly because of COVID, because we're all at home. Vandalism. Unfortunately, we do see a fair bit of vandalism, swastikas drawn on things like that. an exception this past year, with the Hamas-Israel conflict. We did see public reports, quite a bit of violence.
Is there an economic driver behind this? Does economic disparity play into hatred of the other?
It's a great question. I think a lot of people assume that. Personally, I don't think so at all. Because the same argument could be made if you have lower education, are you more likely to be anti-Semitic?
Right.
Very educated. I mean, look at Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Very, very educated society.
Yeah. Completely
Completely anti-Semitic. So there's unfortunately different reasons for different people to hate.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to get into a little bit of delicate ground here, and the way I phrase my questions will be challenging. So I'll put it this way first. Why Jews? And I'll follow that up with an observation from a lead editorial in the Toronto Star just a few days ago, where they said that Jews are the world's perpetual scapegoat. Mm. Why is that?
I wish I knew. You said before anti-Semitism goes back over 1,000 years. I mean, you could argue it's going thousands of years back into biblical times. Yes. We're talking about anti-Semitism. So there's just this obsession, and unfortunately, a Jew can't run away from it. I mean, if you become a successful person, people become jealous. If you're poor, then how come you can't make a good living, and why do I have to support you? It's like you can't win. Mm-hmm. But perhaps, unfortunately, jealousies drive hate sometimes, and Jews don't view themselves as victims. I mean, Jews brushed themselves off after that Holocaust, and they moved on with their lives, and many created successful businesses in Canada. Yeah. And so maybe some folks said, well, why won't you be that victim? Yeah. So, and there's left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism, as you mentioned, from different that have different historical origins. So it depends where it comes from.
The Star had an editorial a week ago in which they said the results of the latest survey indicating this increase are unsurprising given the tenor of the times. Across the world, there's a rise of nationalism and programs of calculated radicalization and disinformation. Now, Michael, you mentioned that in passing, but what's your reaction to that? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit to that. Nationalistic movements have to have something that they're pushing against and fighting against, and because just historically we become a go-to scapegoat. It's an easy way to blame your problems on Jews. Mm-hmm. It's not my fault. It's somebody else's fault. Okay, well, we'll pick on these guys. It's their fault.
Mm-hmm. That same editorial said authoritarian leaders invoke hate-tinged rhetoric, which has the effect of licensing and normalizing hate. Mm. Do you agree with that?
Sure. Hate, by the time, you asked me before about violence, right? Thankfully, that's not the way Canadians are, and that's not the way we think, and it's not acceptable in Canadian society. Right. But other societies have been broken down through history, and it starts with rhetoric, and then the rhetoric gets more and more aggressive, and then you encourage that violence, and then someone's going to start up that violence, and then other people are going to follow. And that's the pathway to evil, and unfortunately, it works.
I read an article that addressed the role of Jews in anti-Semitism, and I was fascinated by that concept. What this essay said by somebody named Jason Zinnemann is that there is a long, rich Jewish tradition of grappling with anti-Semitism by laughing at it. You're agreeing with that?
I'm smiling, so okay. I'm halfway there.
Okay. Yeah. They gave a couple of examples. Mel Brooks turning Nazis into musical theater buffoons in The Producer, which is just kind of a complete twist. And Sacha Baron Cohen as Borat, leading folks in a southern bar and singing "Throw the Jews Down the Well." Why is there that tendency for Jews to be self-deprecatory?
Well, it's a defense mechanism, but it's a way to get through things. Jews value life above anything else, so you have to find your way through the challenging time, and what better way to do so than with humor? Because, someone's going after you, and you can laugh about it. Yeah. It just drives them even crazier. Not that you want to drive them crazier, but you want to show them you're not winning here. And humor is a way to push back on that.
That was in this essay, the author said, some artists argue that making light of prejudice or turning purveyors of it into absurdities robs hatred of power. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and I honestly believe that, because that's what these folks crave, is the power.
That author concluded by saying, as a critic, I'm increasingly uncomfortable with this kind of condescension. So he goes all the way through explaining it, and then kind of pulls back.
Right. Well, because that's where we're at. We change a lot, and there's more of a woke climate in the world today, but it is still important to poke fun at ourselves.
The same sort of thing happens in movie casting. I'm sure you're familiar with this theme. British comedian David Baddiel argued that casting is one of the many issues in contemporary discourse that illustrates how anti-Semitism is far more accepted than other forms of bigotry. Have you had people bring that to you, that concern?
In terms of a lack of Jewish casting?
Yes.
No.
Or non-Jews being cast as
Jews?
Yeah.
You know what? Honestly, I haven't heard that so much. I mean, there's been some very famous Jews portrayed by non-Jews.
Yeah.
I really don't hear that as a major concern from the community.
One of the things that I read was that sometimes Jews hold other Jews back from success. And an example that was given was that a Jewish executive at NBC thought Jerry Seinfeld was too Jewish to succeed and didn't offer him a job. Another example that I love Jackie Mason. Okay, so I just think he's hysterical. And there was a comedy called The World According to Me that he did back in the 80s. And he said, you know what's going to happen to this show? The Gentiles will say it's a hit, and the Jews will say it's too Jewish.
Yeah. and it's funny because it's true. I love Jackie Mason, by the way, and he's like a proud Jew, proud Zionist.
Yeah.
And it's very true, because every Jew thinks that they're an expert in Judaism, and there are many Jews, unfortunately, that, and especially ones that feel that way, are oftentimes running away from their Judaism. They want to fit into the broader society.
Right.
And there's always this push and pull for Jewish people.
Yes.
That if you're going to fit in with everybody else, do I, abandon, my name? That's why many people change their names in Hollywood to make it more, Western sounding.
There is a tendency sometimes for people with Jewish roots to deny those roots. And I'm sure we've all heard these stories, but I heard one recently where one woman said to another woman at a social function, you probably don't know this, but I'm Jewish. We're probably the only two Jewish people in the room. And the chair of the meeting overheard this and said, nobody knows this, but I'm Jewish too. Is that prevalent?
It still happens. Yeah. It does. I'm sure it was much more prevalent, in the 50s and 60s when the society at that time, but it definitely, there are those that are really uncomfortable in their own skin.
Yeah. Michael, how do we, and I don't expect you can answer this question, but I want to explore it a bit. How do we stop hate? What's the action that society has to take to begin to move away from me against you, group against group, religion against religion, political party against political party, nation against nation. How do we get past this?
One thing we can do is just, when we're using language, we were talking about the definition of anti-Semitism, clarity of language. In this debate, a lot of folks use the term tolerance nowadays. And personally, I think tolerance is such a low bar that nobody should be satisfied. I don't want to be tolerated. If you're tolerating me, you're already implying that you have prejudice against me, and but I'll tolerate you. So I think as a society, we need to raise that bar to demand basic respect, demand equality under the law, and demand that all of our institutions of justice and police, the courts, our government, will have red lines and just say, this is acceptable, it's not. And it doesn't matter, if you're a major group or you're a minor group, this is the way that we treat everybody. Once we start treating everybody as humans, we'll get past it.
Religious groups are often the least tolerant, to use the term you just used, and yet the major world religions all grow out of two basic tenets: love God, love one another. How come we don't get the second half of that?
I don't know. Well, and I mean, you could say that we're not getting the first half of that.
Yeah,
we're not getting
true.
the second half of that too, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes it's a matter of just like you're just looking at yourself. Look how great I am. Look how religious and pious I am, and you're looking at the wrong person, and not walking in other people's shoes. And so I think people have to take themselves less seriously, and work to accept.
The UN has passed special resolutions recently designating an international day to combat Islamophobia, I think just in the middle of March. The UN Special Rapporteur on the freedom of religion or belief said that Islamophobia has reached epidemic proportions. Is that a problem that you perceive? I know you're interested in hatred, not just anti-Semitism, but of all groups. Is Islamophobia a continuing problem, or has that moderated a bit?
Well, it's a real issue. Targeting of Muslims for hate is real, and it happens. There are many groups that are targeted for hate, unfortunately. They're one of them. Statistically speaking, in 2020, fortunately, it's been trending downwards. I think it was a 50% drop in 2020, which is fantastic. I wish I could say the same against the Jewish community, which is continuing to rise up right now.
Do things like that UN resolution have any real-world effect?
Fortunately, not a lot that comes out of the United Nations, in my opinion, has a real-world effect, because I think the United Nations is a pretty dark place, and they don't tend to get things right.
The UN Secretary General decried anti-Semitism. In November 2005, a resolution was adopted to recognize the Holocaust on January 27th, the date when Auschwitz, Birkenau was liberated. Has that action by the UN had any positive effect?
It's appreciated. The acknowledgement is appreciated. But at the same time, when the United Nations is regularly singling out and demonizing the state of Israel, the only Jewish state in the world, and you compare the both, many in the Jewish community see this as an opportunity to cry over dead Jews and say, and we can acknowledge that, and then in the next breath, we're attacking Jews for standing up for themselves against terrorism, modern Jews that choose not to die.
Right.
So, there's the Jewish community overall is very unhappy with the double standards that come out from the United Nations.
In January of this year, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning denial of the Holocaust and urging all nations and social media companies to take active measures. And at a service commemorating victims of the Holocaust, the Secretary General urged people around the world to stand firm against hate and bigotry anywhere and everywhere. I know you have not full confidence in the way the UN actually conducts its business, but I'm just wondering, do those kinds of statements, do you take some comfort from that?
I do, and that's different, and actually that is very important because one of the contemporary forms of anti-Semitism, particularly from the extreme right, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, they do continue to deny and distort the Holocaust. So it's that is extremely important. And we see, as you mentioned before, in Europe, we see nationalists that sort of play on that and say, oh, it's the Jews that are trying to extort, based on things in the Holocaust that really didn't happen and was really their fault. So that is very important.
You've mentioned that the state of Israel is the brunt of some negative reactions at the United Nations. I know that there are people who are afraid to criticize anything that Israel does for fear they'll be viewed as being anti-Semitic. How do you counsel a non-Jew about how they can react to what's happening in the state of Israel without being perfectly positive all the time and not risk?
Sure. It's a great question, and some of the greatest critics of the state of Israel today are Jews inside of Israel, Jews outside of Israel. There's no Jew that's going to think that a non-Jew is anti-Semitic because they have criticism of Israel. If it's an obsession, if you're saying, Israel can't do anything right, and yet, I'm refusing to hold China or Cuba or Venezuela or Iran or North Korea or Russia to the same standard, well, because that's a problem. But if you're holding Israel to the same standard as any other Western democracy, go at it.
Your comment about Jews themselves taking different positions is interesting. I'll just share a quick little story with you. The first time I went to Israel, my wife and I went on a Jewish trip. It was called Rediscover Your Jewish Soul. And we went with a Jewish friend who had recently been widowed. And at some point early in the trip, there was sort of a dove and hawk vote taken. How many people were ready to smash all the opponents, and how many people wanted to take a softer view? And it was exactly 50-50. Is that issue about peace loving or go to war an ongoing argument in the Jewish community in terms of Israel?
And in terms of where Israel should be, I mean, nobody wants Israel to go to war. The Jewish community worldwide would love it if there was actually a partner for peace currently. But, in Gaza, when you have a terrorist group that's in charge of that territory, you see over and over again, most recently with the acts of terror, you see that there's a group that would prefer to perform terrorism than support their own population and build up their economy.
Right. We talked about how many people are aware of the Holocaust. And the UN Secretary General recently said that barely half of literate adults worldwide have ever heard of the Holocaust. And he thought that lack of knowledge, particularly among young people, was dangerous, and that our response must be education. Is that a role that your organization plays in educating the population at large?
We do, and there's many great organizations, Jewish organizations involved in this, Yad Vashem and others. It's something all groups that are interested in this. I mean, you can't simply fight hate. You have to deal with the other side of the coin in terms of education and educating our youth. And it actually is sad that not just on the Holocaust, but civics, Canadian history, history in general, this is something that's not being taught, and I think it's harmful overall to society.
I think if every young person was to be able to go to a concentration camp and Yad Vashem, the attitudes towards the Holocaust would change greatly. In Germany, as you know, every young person, every teen must go to a concentration camp. And the idea behind that is that we must remember what happened. We can't forget what happened.
And it impacts you personally when you do that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little more about you and a little less about these deep subjects. I want to commend you on having received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012, and maybe you can tell us what's going on here.
Well, here I'm getting pinned by Minister Peter Kent.
Right, the former journalist.
Yes.
Yeah. And you received that in recognition of your community service to Canada, so congratulations. The lady in whose honor you received that, oh, look who's in the background again.
He's one of these recurring figures in my life.
Yeah. Is that a cardboard prop that you just bring with you? Or?
I have a few of those at home, but
that's not it?
She's not one of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us what the occasion is.
So this was when the Queen came to Toronto. I was fortunate enough to have been invited to the state dinner. And this was one of the things that I'm, again, going back to my mother, that she taught me, how to eat. And, although I've never seen that many forks and spoons in my life, it was quite intimidating.
Yeah. Now, did you get briefed on what you say or do as you're meeting?
We did. It was about a half an hour, and you had military generals, cabinet ministers, a who's who, and then and me, and I was there. And one of the things that was so interesting was of all of the instructions they're giving, and it was fascinating for me to watch, like military generals, cabinet ministers, and everybody's nervous. You suddenly realize that we're provincial in Canada. The Queen has arrived, and she is and I've met other royalty, and I've met other presidents and prime ministers. She is a queen, is what I can say. And so one thing that was so interesting, and you'll see here, I was shaking her hand. They told us that when you meet the Queen and you get called in by a herald and they announce your name, but when you meet the Queen, you do not extend your hand to the Queen, right?
She'll decide.
You bow to the Queen. Yeah, she decides if she wants to engage in conversation, she'll reach out her hand, and then you can take her hand. Yeah. And everybody was freaking out. But I was actually the only person in the room. It didn't bother me at all.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you.
The reason why is that in Jewish tradition, for an Orthodox Jewish woman, you're not supposed to extend your hand to them. So for me, I thought, I'll just pretend she's an Orthodox Jew. And then I'm like, this is easy.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. Tell us about this picture.
So this is myself with, actually, I think this might have been in 2014, with the former UN Secretary General.
And what was the occasion?
This was the occasion he had come to Canada. Actually, it was it must have been 2015 because Prime Minister Trudeau was there. And so he had come into Ottawa. This was a dinner in his honor.
Great. Now, who's this guy?
So this is Senator Joe Lieberman.
And he was pretty famous 20 years ago or so. Tell us about that.
He was. Well, I mean, he was a vice presidential candidate, and an interesting guy who could. We're talking about polarization. Here's a Democrat that had a Republican, John McCain, as his best friend.
Yeah.
And this was actually in Lithuania.
Was it?
In the Lithuanian Parliament? Yeah.
Now, he was Al Gore's running mate in 2000, And he was a hanging chad away from being the vice president of the USA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And would have been the first Jewish vice president.
Yeah, and he was quite forthright about his Jewishness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Who's this?
So on the far side, that's again Michael Levitt, that's as a member of Parliament, and
Right.
And right beside me is former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien.
And what was the occasion here?
This was actually, I think this was also at former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's event in Ottawa. And this is former Premier Kathleen Wynne, and that was actually in Israel.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Was that a trade mission?
Yes, it was. There was an Ontario Economic Trade Mission.
Okay. And who's this?
So this is Premier Jason Kenney.
One of the increasingly less popular Canadians. Now, we don't have much time left, but can you tell me in about 15 seconds what the future holds for Michael Mostyn?
Sure. Future holds. I'm not one of those guys who plans everything out in his life. So you know what? I'm very fortunate to be where I am, and I'm fortunate to be a spokesperson for my community at a time of rising hate. That I can use my skill set this way, and we'll see what happens. But I'm just so fortunate to be with B'Nai Brith today.
I want to thank Rogers Community Television and in particular our producer for this program, Madison Fitzpatrick. I want to thank the MCC staff and especially technician Glenn Irwin, who worked very hard to get our slide deck put together for the program today. Our season sponsors, Michelle Deschamps, if you will take back to Kathy and Jeff our thanks for your continuing sponsorship of the program. Alan, through you, we'll thank your classmates for sponsoring this program. I want to thank our A Day in the Life team, John Farragher, Brian McKell, Lorianne Clancy, Jen Parker, Doris Sloan, Jonathan Wallace, Dan Broom, and Michelle Thibodeau, who help us to stay on the straight and narrow. I want to thank my old buddy Bill Mackey, who suggested Bill and I grew up on the main street of Midland, so we were regular visitors to your grandfather as he opened his store at 9 o'clock in the morning to see if we could get a bargain. And I'll inform those of you who are here in the hall and also those watching on television that our next guest will be Georgian College President and CEO Mary Lynn West Moynes. And again, this is timely because Mary Lynn is retiring in June as the president of Georgian College, so we will be honored to have her as our guest on May the 3rd, and tickets are available now for that program. To those of you in our live audience, Michael and I will be delighted to meet and greet you in the atrium if you'll meet us out there. Michael, I want to thank you. It's a real pleasure to get to know you. I know so many of your families, but I've really been honored to get to know you. You've been a great guest, and you certainly have broadened my education, so thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line. Email us or connect with us on social media.
Sometimes it's hard to say goodbye to an old friend. But when you're saying farewell to your vehicle, Kidney Car makes it fast and easy. Just call or visit our website. We'll take any vehicle in any condition and give you a tax receipt for a minimum of $300. No headaches and no towing charges. It's the one-stop solution for getting rid of your unwanted vehicle in just a few short minutes. When your vehicles reach the